Yalta and Potsdam Conferences. American History, Unit 6. Learning Objective, Politics and Law. Read the learning objective aloud. Discuss the U.S.'s broad political reasons for entering World War II and how those motivations and wartime experiences informed post war policies and the Cold War. For this lesson, you will need paper, pencil, computer or mobile device, headphones. You may move at your own pace. Feel free to pause or rewind the video as you need. A text version of our assignment is available on our website. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Lesson agenda. I do. Lecture. We do. Guided reading. You do. Check for understanding and lesson review. For the lecture, I'd like to present you with Mr. Lyons' 5 W's. The who, why, when, where, and words of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. Who? This question has to be answered in 2 parts. There were 2 conferences with 2 different sets of leaders. At the first conference, Yalta, you had Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. At the second conference, the Potsdam Conference, you had Clement Attlee of the United Kingdom, Harry Truman of the United States, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Why? In its simplest answer, the reason that these big 3 met at these conferences was to discuss the plans for a post war world. When? The Yalta Conference happened between February 4th and February 11th, 1945. The Potsdam Conference happened from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945. Where? Yalta is located in Crimea on the coast of the Black Sea. Where? Potsdam is located just outside of Berlin, Germany. Words. Yalta. Big 3. Poland. Declaration of Liberated Europe. Communism versus non-communism. Eastern Bloc. Post-war world. Reparations. Potsdam. Big 3. Atomic bomb. Partition of Germany. Communism versus non-communism. Post-war world. United Nations. Security Council. Veto. Check for understanding. 1. How much of the information can you recall from the introduction? Can you remember the who, the why, the when, the where, and the words? Creating the United Nations. Before the war ended, President Roosevelt had wanted to ensure that war would never again engulf the world. He believed that a new international political organization could prevent another world war. In 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Estate in Washington, D.C., delegates from 39 countries met to discuss the new organization, which was to be called the United Nations. The delegates at the conference agreed that the UN would have a General Assembly, in which every member nation in the world would have one vote. The UN would also have a Security Council with 11 members. 5 countries would be permanent members of the Security Council: Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States. These 5 permanent members would each have veto power. On April 25, 1945, representatives from 50 countries came to San Francisco to officially organize the United Nations and design its charter. The General Assembly was given the power to vote on resolutions and to choose the non-permanent members of the Security Council. The Security Council was responsible for international peace and security. It could ask members to use military force to uphold a UN resolution. Yalta Conference. In February 1945, with the war in Europe nearly over, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta, a Soviet resort on the Black Sea, to plan the post-war world. Several agreements reached at Yalta later played an important role in causing the Cold War. A key issue discussed at Yalta was Poland. Shortly after the Germans had invaded Poland in 1939, the Polish government fled to Britain. In 1944, however, Soviet troops drove back the Germans and entered Poland. As they liberated Poland from German control, the Soviets encouraged Polish communists to set up a new government. As a result, 2 governments claimed the right to govern Poland, one communist and one non-communist. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill both argued that the Poles should be free to choose their own government. Stalin, however, quickly pointed out that every time invaders had entered Russia from the west, they had come through Poland. Eventually, the 3 leaders compromised. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to recognize the Polish government set up by the Soviets. Stalin agreed it would include members of the pre-war Polish government, and free elections would be held as soon as possible. After reaching a compromise on Poland, the 3 leaders agreed to issue the Declaration of Liberated Europe. The declaration echoed the Atlantic Charter, asserting the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they live. The Allies promised that the people of Europe would be allowed to create democratic institutions of their own choice, and to create temporary governments that represented all democratic elements. They pledged the earliest possible establishment through free elections of governments responsive to the will of the people. Check for understanding. 2. What other president from a prior unit had a plan similar to Roosevelt's to prevent a world war? 3. What 5 nations were given permanent seats on the UN Security Council? 4. In your own words, describe the Allies' controversy over Poland that came up at Yalta. Promise made in the Declaration of Liberated Europe. Potsdam Conference. The leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the big three powers who had defeated Nazi Germany, met at the Potsdam Conference near Berlin from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, in what was a crucial moment in defining the new post World War II balance of power. The summit also gave an early hint of the tensions that would develop between the US and the Soviet Union, which led to a Cold War struggle that lasted for more than 4 decades. The conference was attended by US President Harry S. Truman, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was abruptly replaced on July 26th by his successor, Clement Attlee. The major issue at Potsdam was the question of how to handle Germany. At Yalta, the Soviets had pressed for heavy post war reparations from Germany, half of which would go to the Soviet Union. While Roosevelt had acceded to such demands, Truman and his Secretary of State, James Byrnes, were determined to mitigate the treatment of Germany by allowing the occupying nations to exact reparations only from their own zone of occupation. Despite numerous disagreements, the Allied leaders did manage to conclude some agreements at Potsdam. For example, the negotiators confirmed the status of a demilitarized and disarmed Germany under 4 zones of Allied occupation. According to the protocol of the conference, there was to be a complete disarmament and demilitarization of Germany. All aspects of German industry that could be utilized for military purposes were to be dismantled. All German military and paramilitary forces were to be eliminated, and the production of all military hardware in Germany was forbidden. Furthermore, German society was to be remade along democratic lines by a repeal of all discriminatory laws from the Nazi era and by the arrest and trial of those Germans deemed to be war criminals. The Potsdam Conference is perhaps best known for President Truman's July 24, 1945 conversation with Stalin, during which time the president informed the Soviet leader that the United States had successfully detonated the first atomic bomb on July 16, 1945. Historians have often interpreted Truman's somewhat firm stance during negotiations to the U.S. negotiating team's belief that U.S. nuclear capability would enhance its bargaining power. Stalin, however, was already well informed about the U.S. nuclear program thanks to the Soviet intelligence network, so he also held firm in his positions. This situation made negotiations challenging. The leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, who, despite their differences, had remained allies throughout the war, never met again collectively to discuss cooperation in post war reconstruction. This map illustrates the partition of Germany. On the right, you have the Soviet controlled East Germany. On the left, you have the democratically controlled West Germany. This area was split between the British, the French, and the Americans. Check for understanding. 6. Compared to the Yalta Conference, what changes had taken place at the Potsdam Conference? 7. Describe the issue between Stalin and Truman at the Potsdam Conference. 8. What agreement did the Big Three come to at the Potsdam Conference? 9. Explain Truman's stance during negotiations. Why did he have this position? Lesson review. Write 1 to 2 paragraphs summarizing the lesson by answering the prompt. What decisions made at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences would have long lasting effects on international politics? Homework. Add today's topics to your learning objective review. End of lesson. Make sure your name, date, class are at the top right-hand corner of your paper.